I hope you're all well and that you and your families continue to stay healthy and safe. We're grateful to have you with us for today's Fighting Hate from Home, where we will be discussing ADL's 2019 Audit of Anti-Semitic Incidents. 2019 brought with it a surge of anti-Semitism, including age-old anti-Semitic tropes, which have also surfaced in the past several months amid the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen the slander that Jews and/or Israel manufactured the coronavirus to advance their global control, that Jews are profiting from the coronavirus, and other terrible theories. Joining us on today's call to unpack this information and further explain are ADL CEO and National Director Jonathan Greenblatt, ADL's Vice President of the Center on Extremism, Oren Siegel, and Southern Divisional Vice President Allison Padilla-Goodman, whose division covers 9 states, including South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And now I'm pleased to turn the call over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Deb. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining today. Before we start, I'd just like to say a word or two about what the audit is and what it is not. You know, there are a number of ways to evaluate anti-Semitism, and at ADL, the oldest anti-hate organization in the world, we've been doing this work since the first part of the 20th century, so we know a lot about anti-Semitism and hate. In order to understand this phenomenon, you could do public opinion surveys to see how many people necessarily hold anti-Semitic beliefs. That's one measure, and we do that. Another way is to use big data analysis to try to understand anti-Semitism in the online environment, in the social media ecosystems which we all inhabit. And ADL does that as well. But perhaps the oldest measure of anti-Semitism that we do is the effort to tally and quantify the actual number of anti-Semitic incidents that real people experience in their lives. What does it mean to be a Jew in America as far as the direct experiences and interactions of anti-Semitism? This is what we've been doing with our audit since 1979. Working through our network of 25 field offices across the country and our programs, which are distributed in far more cities around America. Another important point is what do we define as an incident? What do we mean by it when we say that? Let me just say off the bat, we shouldn't confuse anti-Semitic incidents with hate crimes. A hate crime is a technical category of criminal activity based on the legal environment of the jurisdiction in which it was prosecuted. Some of the instances of the audit indeed are hate crimes. For example, an act of violence or an act of vandalism, which would be a felony and a misdemeanor respectively. Our audit goes further than that. We look broadly at bias incidents, not necessarily only crimes. So for example, a bullying incident at a school, someone being harassed on public transportation, a person being intimidated in the workplace. Those are all examples of behavior that wouldn't necessarily get the attention of law enforcement, but they get our attention at ADL, and we track them. Finally, there is the issue of how do we define anti-Semitism? In most instances, it's fairly straightforward, such as when someone uses an anti-Jewish slur or scrawls a swastika on a synagogue. But sometimes it's not quite so simple. White supremacy on one hand, or anti-Zionism on the other hand. They each pose challenges to the definition of anti-Semitism. We'll discuss that a little more in the context of this talk. And I just do want to add that although the audit focuses on anti-Semitism, ADL as a whole, since 1913, has focused not only on stopping the defamation of the Jewish people, but as it's written in our mission statement, we work to secure justice and fair treatment to all. And our organization was founded on this very simple presence, that the Jewish people would only be safe in America when all people were safe. And when all minorities, when all marginalized groups can freely enjoy the rights and privileges of living here in this great country, so too would its Jewish minority. But in keeping with our core mission, in keeping with the focus of this call, let's take stock of what we're seeing on the ground right now in America around anti-Semitism. Can we go to the slides? Okay, let me just adjust my screen here, sorry. So first, let's just talk through the executive summary. If you remember nothing else, here are the headlines. 2019 saw the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents that the ADL has ever tracked in literally 40 years of collecting this data. The information, the data doesn't lie. Something is going on. Again, we've had more incidents in all 48 contiguous states than we've ever seen. And those incidents, go back to the last slide, please. They're up. Go back to the last slide, please. Go back. Can we get back to the executive summary slide, please? The numbers were up in all the major categories. So I mentioned a few minutes ago, harassment, vandalism, violence. They're up in every category, and there were nearly 100 victims of anti-Semitic violence in 2019. And there were 5 people who were killed in some of the most high-profile and horrendous acts of anti-Semitism, again, that we've tracked in 40 years. At the ADL, we take a very data-driven, evidence-based approach to this work, and the data tells us something quite shocking that we're going to get into now over the course of this call. Okay, next slide, please. So, over almost a 15-year period since 2015, the number of anti-Semitic incidents had been declining, and then something changed in 2016. And the number spiked 34% year over year. And most of those events, by the way, were anchored toward the second half of the year, and they seemed to be triggered by events that took place in the context of the presidential election. In 2017, the year of Charlottesville, the number of anti-Semitic incidents leapt an astonishing 57%, the single largest increase we've seen on record. In 2018, while the numbers dipped 5% overall, it was still the 3rd highest total we had ever collected, and the number of incidents of violence, the number of assaults more than doubled year over year. And of course, 2018 was punctuated by the massacre in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And now, as you can see on the red bar, in 2019, the highest total we've ever included. It's a big problem, and we're going to talk more about it now. Next slide. So now take a look. What this slide does is breaks down on a type basis the different, again, the 3 categories that I mentioned earlier that we look at. So first, you can pay attention to the kind of white bar. When you start to peel back the layers and you look at the number of acts of harassment, the total was 1,127, and that was up 6% year over year. So this could mean someone, yelling a slur at a Jewish person on a street corner. Again, that might not get the attention of law enforcement, but we care about it. That could mean someone, again, bullying a child at school with anti-Semitic jokes, to someone finding an anti-Semitic meme posted to their social media page. Those are all examples of harassment. Secondly, vandalism. That's sort of the light red bar, 919 events last year. That was up 19% year over year. This kinds of incidents could range from a swastika drawn on a mailbox, to slurs that get graffitied on a synagogue, to vandalized menorahs, to mezuzahs torn off doorposts. And then finally, we come to the most tragic category. These are acts of violence, physical assaults on Jewish people. Now, this can range from a punching or a shoving, stabbing, or a ramming with a car, and then, of course, a shooting. We logged 61 incidents of anti-Semitic assault in 2019, up an extraordinary 56% from the prior year, including 3 serious assaults and 5 deaths. The Poway, talking about the deaths, those happened around some very high-profile acts that were well covered in the news. First, the mass shooting at the Chabad Synagogue in Poway, California, back in April, which killed 1 person. Then there was the shooting attack that was perpetrated by a white supremacist. Then there was the shooting attack on a Jewish grocery store in Jersey City in December, perpetrated by 2 members of the Black Hebrew Israelite sect. instead of a fringe religious group where 3 people were killed. And then there was the knifing attack where an assailant burst into a private home in Monsey, New York, and stabbed several people, killing an adult male while he was lighting a menorah. So to be clear, the 3 fatalities in the Jersey City shooting count for only 1 incident of the 61. We don't count that 3 times. That's because at ADL, we adhere to the best practices stipulated by the FBI, which track national crime rates by the number of attacks, not the number of victims. But it should be clear that the 61 incidents that we logged included 95 individual victims of anti-Semitic assault, including the 3 in Jersey City. Now, I just want to say one thing about all of the incidents we're tracking here. So at ADL, we collect this information through multiple sources. Sometimes individuals, the victims themselves, members of their family or friends, people who hear about something will reach out to us via the phone, via email, via our website where they can fill out an online form. They might come to one of our offices and let us know about an incident. In other situations, we might hear about something in the press or via social media or hear something word of mouth. And then through our 25 offices, our people investigate and verify every incident. So we know the data that we're collecting is sound because we have ensured that we're not just reporting on rumors or including innuendo. No, everything we include has been verified. Can we go to the next slide? I'd like to just pause for a minute and look at some of the higher profile attacks that I mentioned earlier. Each of them bears a closer look. So first, the shooting in Poway. That took place 6 months to the day after the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue. As I said a few minutes ago, it was perpetrated by a white supremacist and done so on the last day of Passover. In the hours after the attack, ADL's Center on Extremism, our researchers were some of the best in the country at understanding these issues of violent white supremacy and Black Hebrew Israelites. We track all different kinds of extremist groups. They were able to identify a manifesto allegedly written by the shooter that was filled with violent white supremacist and anti-Semitic language, and added that he had committed an arson attack on a mosque just 6 months before the actual shooting incident. Again, our analysts spotted that manifesto and shared it with law enforcement. Secondly, the attack on the kosher supermarket in Jersey City. As I mentioned a moment ago, was committed by 2 individuals, one of whom the ADL was able to identify adhered to the, quote, Black Hebrew Israelite ideology. Now, it's important to note, not all Black Hebrew Israelites are anti-Semitic. But there is a segment of this group who many believe that modern Jews are imposters and, quote unquote, usurpers of the true identity of biblical Hebrews, including this individual, David Anderson. Anderson possessed a violent hatred for Jews and police officers, and I noted before the 3 people killed in the market. It's also worth remembering that he also murdered a law enforcement officer earlier in the day. The final fatality that we tracked in 2020 occurred in Monsey, New York, in Rockland County. That individual was stabbed to death and died of his wounds later on. He was attacked by an individual named Thomas Grafton, who apparently was suffering from mental illness, but it was very clear that he also, from his writings and his social media profile, that he had been inspired by anti-Semitic ideology. And lastly, while no one thankfully was killed, I would be remiss if I didn't call out the large number of assaults and attacks suffered by Jews in Brooklyn, New York, especially toward the end of the year. Again, there wasn't a dramatic attack that may have captured the headlines, but of the 61 attacks that I mentioned, 25 last year occurred in Brooklyn, including 8 assaults during the final 8 days of the year. All 8 of these documented assaults were perpetrated against individuals who were visibly Jewish. Objects were thrown at them, anti-Semitic slurs were shouted, and at least 3 victims were either hit or punched in their heads or faces. And lastly, it's just worth pointing out, whereas in Poway you had the white supremacist, In Jersey City, you had the Black Hebrew Israelite member. But as you can see, the politics and motives vary in all of these cases. The fact of the matter is, anti-Semitism happens on both sides of the political spectrum. Anti-Semitism isn't the domain of just one, or isn't just the preoccupation of just one faith or religious group. Anti-Semitism happens everywhere in an organized and unorganized way. That's why it's so critical that we call it out wherever and whenever it happens, and we really endeavor to do that here at ADL. Now, to take us further into the data, I'd like to turn things over to Oren Siegel, Vice President of our Center on Extremism. Oren?
Thank you so much, Jonathan. These really are sobering numbers and a reminder of what kept us all so busy in 2019. Before I delve into some additional data and findings, I just wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to join this call, joining Jonathan and others. So much of what we do is meant to educate the public because we know that good information, good data is a requirement for awareness. And that awareness is a requirement for actual change. So we really do appreciate people taking the time to join this call. Okay, back to the data. We documented, next slide please, a 12% decrease in the number of incidents at Jewish institutions in 2019. While any decrease is welcome, I should note that this specific decrease does not negate the fact that extremists, for example, continue to perpetrate acts of vandalism and even deadly assault at our institutions. Indeed, 40 times in 2019, an extremist or somebody sympathetic with an extremist ideology either walked up or drove up to his or her local Jewish institution, be it a synagogue, a JCC, a day school, and physically dropped or taped a hateful flyer onto that institution. Combined with the Poway shooting, that data really underscores the need for heightened attention to Jewish communal security. And as the next slide will show, there is another maybe small bright spot, which is the fact that there was a slight decrease of incidents on college and university campuses as well. Of the 186 incidents, 97 were harassment, 89 were vandalism on college and university campuses. Thankfully, in 2019, there were no assaults during that year. Now, as might be expected, 20% of the campus incidents involved references to Israel or to Zionism. This is an issue that Jonathan will address a bit further later in this call. Next slide, please. When we're tracking anti-Semitic incidents, we have to pay special attention to the non-Jewish K-12 schools, and you'll see the data on your screen there. On one level, the reason we do that is because ADL is committed to helping, make sure that every student in this country is able to obtain an education free of anti-Semitic vandalism, assault, or harassment. But we're also particularly concerned about anti-Semitic incidents in K-12 schools because what those incidents may actually foretell about the future of anti-Semitism, what we might be facing down the line. What occurs in schools can be something of a barometer for trends in the broader population. And that's why it's particularly relevant to develop this data outside of the fact that, we are talking about our kids. So unfortunately, incidents in K-12 schools in 2019 rose to 411. These included things like a student announcing to the entire class that the Nazis should have killed all the Jews, or ongoing harassment by peers who taunted Jewish students with Holocaust jokes. Some of this occurred in real life. Some of this also occurred in social media, where many more people are obviously spending their time, especially during this time of the pandemic. There were 220 cases of anti-Semitic vandalism at K-12 schools as well. These include swastikas, anti-Semitic messages being drawn on school walls, and even assaults. The truth is, and the sad truth is, we believe that these numbers are only the tip of the iceberg. All the locations that we are tracking in the audit, we suspect incidents in schools are the most severely underreported. Next slide, please. So, we have touched a bit already on the extremist activity, but I really want to reinforce one core fact about our findings, and that's this. The vast majority of anti-Semitic incidents that make up our audit are not committed by extremists. Anti-Semitism is simply not the sole domain of extremism. That has been a consistent finding ever since we've been doing this audit. The perpetrators, those that we know of, are often your average Joe, your average Jane, if you will. They're kids, they're adults, it's occurring online and offline, poor neighborhoods, affluent communities. They are not constrained by specific ideology or politics. Indeed, the audit of anti-Semitic incidents, can be, the data in there can be found in pretty much every segment of society. Yet every year, our work documenting these anti-Semitic incidents intersect with our work combating and responding to extremism and extremist threats. Jonathan already spoke about the explicitly anti-Semitic assaults, the major attacks that rocked the Jewish community from coast to coast, whether motivated by white supremacist ideology in Poway, whether connected to Black Hebrew Israelite ideology in Jersey City. Two different ideologies, similar deadly results. Another reminder that anti-Semitism is the lifeblood of extremism across the ideological spectrum, and that violence is often not that far behind. Now, known extremist groups and individuals inspired by extremist ideologies were responsible for 270 of the anti-Semitic incidents in our audit. That's up from 249. That's a full 13% of the total number of incidents in 2019. 212 of those were propaganda distributions perpetrated by organized white supremacist groups. For example, the Daily Stormer Book Club or the Loyal White Knights, which is a Klan group. Now, these flyers included, among other things, narratives about the Holocaust being fake news, that Jews molest children, or that Jews are working to subvert American culture. We saw a specific campaign that was dubbed Operation Kristallnacht, organized by the white supremacist group / movement, The Base. Synagogues in Michigan and Wisconsin were targeted with anti-Semitic graffiti, with swastikas and with Nazi imagery. And it was organized by an 18-year-old in New Jersey. Again, showing that what happens online, the ability to coordinate and organize, has real world impact. Now, these narratives and conspiracy theories behind much of the hatred that animated the anti-Semitic incidents that are extremist related in 2019, they continue to animate the landscape in this time of the pandemic. We have talked about Zoom bombing or conspiracies that exist in these online spaces where we are spending our time trying to get entertainment, connect with community, and connect with family. Those are the same platforms that extremists are trying to exploit and leverage. So these narratives from last year are animating what we're seeing today, including an extremist who tried to bomb an assisted living home in Massachusetts last month. Or just the news yesterday of an individual in Queens who made many anti-Semitic statements online and who was arrested for trying to purchase an illegal weapon. So today, we are focusing on data from 2019. But the data is telling us part of the story that's developing in 2020. That's why it is so important to report. The more that we know, the more that not only can we educate communities and raise awareness, but it's also the more that we can actually resource to those threats. So now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Allison Goodman, who is going to share with us some of her experience about this data and what it looks like in real life and on the ground in her community. Allison, take it away.
Thanks, Oren. So my name is Allison Padilla Goodman, and I'm Vice President of the Southern Division, the former Regional Director of the Southeast Region and former Regional Director of the South Central Region. The Southern Division covers 4 regional offices: Atlanta, New Orleans, St. Louis, and Florida. And here you can see the data from my division. And I thought it would be helpful today to talk a little bit about what this data means and kind of what's behind it. So first, in 2019, we saw a general increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the harassment and assaults categories, specifically in my division. And when I think about the stories behind these incidents, harassment and assaults tend to be more confrontational and less anonymous. Something that Jonathan and Oren talk about a lot is fighting the normalization and emboldening of hatred and anti-Semitism. And that is something we see very clearly on the ground in just the types of incidents we work on. It's also important to note that each vandalism incident is usually seen by many people, not just a single victim. And that's something I'm going to dig into a little more in a minute. But as the audit highlights, the two most frequent types of places where we see incidents occur are public spaces and K-12 schools. These are both venues that generally have larger audiences, so these incidents, while only counting as one incident in our audit, usually reverberate well beyond the individual who is targeted and reporting it. Actually, we often get multiple reports about a single incident represented here in the audit. So while these numbers and the data are really, really important, I also think it's crucial to emphasize that each data point has a story, has multiple people involved, and usually involves many ADL staff and partners coordinating for optimal results and comfort to fight back against the rising tide of anti-Semitism. Our teams at the regional level with COE and CSC program staff, with our boards and community partners, get very involved in responding to incidents and ensuring communities that ADL is here and anti-Semitism will never be acceptable. There are so many stories behind each and every incident. Just in my division, a South Carolina Jewish boy was told on the basketball court that his family should have been killed in the Holocaust so that he would not be alive today. Kill more Jews was written on a dormitory hall whiteboard at Georgia Tech, and swastikas drawn outside of a Tennessee apartment complex, and on and on. I thought it might be helpful to dive a little deeper into one recent incident. So next slide, please. So on April 18th of 2020, the first night of Passover, and in the midst of the COVID quarantine, a Chaim synagogue in Huntsville, Alabama was grossly vandalized. Horrific anti-Semitic messages were spray painted all over the synagogue and very much in clear public view. The messages included swastikas and SS bolts, messages about the Holocaust, and clear anti-Semitic content, as you can see in these pictures. The graffiti covered many surfaces of the synagogue, including on the trees and the sign in the synagogue's front lawn, and the photos got published widely. The very next night, on April 9th, the Chabad in Huntsville was vandalized as well, with much of the same graffiti. So ADL was immediately alerted when this happened, and we got in touch with key leaders in the community, the synagogue's rabbi and executive director, the long-term Jewish community activists, the Huntsville PD agents handling the case, the mayor. We offered support in the law enforcement investigation, including additional reward money to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. We assisted the community in response and have stayed in regular contact with our friends in Huntsville as they rebuild confidence in these unusual times. What these vicious pictures don't show, though, is what community reaction to this vandalism actually was. Next slide, please. So Huntsville, Alabama is a very interesting community. You may not know that it's also called the Rocket City. It's home to the largest space museum in the world. And because of this major space center, it's an incredibly diverse community with a high value on community interaction. And because of this, Huntsville has been participating in ADL's No Place for Hate initiative district-wide for several years. This year, they will be completing their 6th year. In that context, the community reaction to the vandalism was illustrative. As soon as the vandalism surfaced, church and community groups flooded the synagogue with support. They came out that morning to support the Jewish community in full force, bringing the equipment and tools needed to actually clean the graffiti off the surfaces so that the Jews would not have to do so on their holy day. And mind you, this is also during the pandemic when resources are in high demand. They sent food and plants and flowers and handmade cards, and they made sure that the Jews were not alone. This here is a card that a young girl made for the synagogue, and I find it so touching, especially with the steeple on the top of the synagogue, which makes it obvious that this young girl doesn't really know that much about Judaism or our places of worship, but that didn't stop her from pouring out love and solidarity. So these happy endings, they don't always make the headlines, and they aren't behind every single anti-Semitic incident, but they are behind a lot of them. And I hope that with ADL's work to empower and educate others to stand up to anti-Semitism and hate, that we'll see even more. So back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Allison. I appreciate it, and I'm glad we were able to share that story of hope. So I want to say a few words about our next slide. Can I ask the, great. Let's talk just for a minute about anti-Zionism. There were 175 incidents in 2019 where we explicitly saw references to Israel or Zionism in some way. That was an increase from 2018's number of 140. Now, a good number of those incidents were also perpetrated by white supremacists, but the vast majority were not. There were also everyday expressions of anti-Zionism that were used to harass Jews. For instance, you see the rock here on the left. It's an iconic fixture for students at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. It's used as a canvas for free and artistic expression. Instead, in this case, it was used to promote an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews were somehow responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks, that Israelis were happy about the tragedy. Absolutely, positively untrue. In this other image, you can see a subway platform where there were the swastikas drawn almost as if they were the equivalent to the Jewish star, and the language that says Israelites are the new Nazis. And there were other examples too that we saw over the course of the year, but I think what I just want to point out here is this represents to me what I call the normalization of anti-Semitism, where you'll see increasingly in the public conversation, people denigrate the Jewish state with the same language and tropes historically used to denigrate the Jewish people. Accusations of conspiracy theories, accusations of excessive influence, accusations even of the blood libel, an unfortunate and ugly scapegoating of Jews, blaming them for large-scale system failures or even pandemics. And we've seen that directed in this COVID-19 environment, not just at Jewish people, but also at the Jewish state, as if Israel was somehow invented the COVID-19 virus, or as if it were somehow pushing to spread it, or lastly trying to profit from it. And this is why we say clearly and unequivocally, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Now, it may be that some people feel strongly about policies of the Jewish state, but let's recognize whether or not it's the intent, and typically it is, but whether or not it's always the intent, the consequences of denigrating the Jewish state and delegitimizing it play into the same historic tropes of denigrating and delegitimizing the Jewish people. And in America and in the world in 2020, this is anti-Semitism, period. Now, I want to say one last thing before we move to Q&A. There are ways we can tackle anti-Semitism. There are things that we can do at the local level, even at the national level. And on that end, I just want to say how thrilled I am, and all of us at ADL are, to see the Senate just yesterday unanimously pass the Never Again Education Act that addresses the increasing lack of knowledge about the Holocaust among our school children. Studies have shown that education about the Holocaust increases kids' sensitivity to issues of prejudice. And 75 years to the, this is the year when we're celebrating the liberation of Dachau and the end of the Shoah. So it's the perfect time to call attention to why we need Holocaust education in all of our classrooms and all of our kids. So we hope that the president will sign this bill into law quickly, And there are other bills in Congress that could fight the rise of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, and we can talk about that. But if you want to take action today, if you want to step up, I want to encourage you to visit our website, adl.org, click the Take Action link right at the top of the homepage, and visit our Be Heard in Congress page, where you can simply fill out a form to contact your elected senators or representatives in Washington, D.C. The link has been placed in the chat, and it will be included in the follow-up from today's email. And one last point. If you or someone you know experiences an anti-Semitic incident, whether it's an act of bullying that happens to a child, some kind of harassment in the workplace or a public setting, an example of vandalism perpetrated against private property, or again in a public place, or even, God forbid, an act of violence, please go to adl.org, click Take Action, and just use our online form to report an incident. Go to adl.org, click Take Action, and report an incident. It doesn't take long, but the impact could be lasting. All right, Deb, maybe I'll toss it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jonathan. And to answer a bunch of questions that have been in the chat, yes, we are recording this call, and the resources that you're seeing are all part of our audit, which is also available on our website. As Jonathan has just said, that's adl.org. So you can find links to both taking action, you can find this audit itself, as well as a ton of other resources that I'm sure you'll find helpful. So there have been a lot of questions about the data. So one of the things I'm going to start with, and Jonathan, Oren, you can both probably speak to this, are online incidents being included in these numbers? And if not, are we able to track those as well?
Can you say that one more time, Deb? Was what in the numbers?
Online incidents.
Oh, online, sorry.
Online.
So, look, I mean, what we do include here are examples where there's a specific sort of cyber campaign against a person where anti-Semitism was part of that effort. So ordinary expressions of anti-Semitism, say on Twitter or on Instagram, we didn't include. But where an individual was targeted with a sort of a campaign of harassment, it was reported to us, that we include. I will say that we are working, just as ADL measures hate in the offline world, not just through our audit, but through the surveys that we do, we're working on a project to measure hate in the online world. We've done some of that. We've got an incredibly exciting effort underway now that we'll be able to share, I hope, later this year.
Thank you for that. Can you speak to how ADL works with law enforcement in creating these incident reports and how those relationships work together? And are they symbiotic? Are we partnering with them? How does that work? How do those relationships feed one another?
Oren, would you like to take that question?
Sure, no problem. So yeah, we work very closely with law enforcement in the sense that, you know, we are seeing not only anti-Semitic incidents every day, but, you know, we have a team who's investigating those incidents. And the orbit around what makes some of this hate so normal, especially in the online space. So we encourage and are there to provide support to a regional complaint that we get, somebody in the community, and it may help them actually reach law enforcement where they may not know where to go, right? So providing that service to be a liaison between the community and law enforcement if they need it. But secondarily, you know, we are providing tips about issues that we're concerned about in order to protect the community. And by the way, all communities, not just the Jewish community. And in response, we know that that law enforcement is going to take these threats seriously. And also, part of the audit is actually made up of reporting that comes from law enforcement. So not everybody is necessarily reporting hate crimes around the country as they should. Not necessarily is everybody capturing anti-Semitic incidents that are not hate crimes. But to the degree that there are law enforcement agencies that are doing that, we are getting some of our data from them and appreciate that. There's room to improve, but it's a really good symbiotic relationship.
Thanks, Oren. Allison, maybe you can speak to that a little bit too, from on the front lines where you're doing this work every day and I'm sure partnering very closely with law enforcement.
Sure. So our relationships with law enforcement are crucial in all of this. We do a lot of ongoing kind of trainings and sharing of resources and intelligence with law enforcement. for many reasons, one of which is so that we can lean on those relationships when the community is in need. And so the Huntsville incident that I explained, I mean, law enforcement was my first call. I've never met with Huntsville PD in person, but they were very eager to take a call from ADL and to talk to us and to work hand in hand in how we could support them. And I asked the officer handling the case, you know, what do you need? What can we do to support? And they said, you know, we really need some additional reward money. We have some ideas for who this might be, but we need something that's going to push somebody over the edge. And so there are always ways where ADL comes in, whether it be through background from the Center on Extremism to inform who are the correct community people that law enforcement need to get in touch with, and how they can be responsive and create good relationships with their community in these times of need.
Thank you for that. Jonathan, can you speak to what you think the percentage of incidents are that are not reported? And I guess perhaps maybe to the accuracy of our data and how we get that data. You spoke about it a little to start, but maybe a little more.
That's a good question. Yeah, if anything, our data undercounts or underreports the actual incidents. We know that historically hate crimes are underreported because people are unsure what is a hate crime, because law enforcement often isn't familiar with it. There are several states, 5 states, in fact, that don't even have hate crimes laws on the books. And things like bias incidents, like a bullying incident at school, often parents or educators or other professionals don't even think to contact ADL. I wouldn't kind of hazard a guess as to what the true number is, as if this was a subset of it. This is, again, we've been doing this for 40 years. So we've got very statistically significant data. But nonetheless, the problem is probably larger than we understand.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, unfortunately. We've received a variety of questions about what the current legislative bills are that are pending and things that are focused on anti-Semitism. And again, I think to sort of expand on what you started to talk about earlier, Jonathan, in terms of where folks can focus their energy to be actively helping.
Well, I think the two that I would call attention to are, number one, the Never Again Education Act, which just literally made it through the Senate yesterday. That calls for mandatory Holocaust education. There are also, by the way, many states which are considering similar legislation. Number two, there's something called the No Hate Act, which is actually the full name. I don't remember. It's named after the woman who was killed in Charlottesville, Heather Heyer, in 2017. She was, rammed by a car driven by a white supremacist. And that act is about making sure that law enforcement has adequate resources so they can track hate crimes, and they're effectively trained up on how to deal with them. That bill is kind of moving through the Congress right now.
Thank you. We have a bunch of questions focusing on how ADL works with other communities to fight hate. So fighting hate that we're seeing certainly rampantly right now in the African American community. Allison, maybe you can speak to that with all of the incidents that have been happening in Georgia. And then Jonathan, perhaps you can follow up with some of our broader partnerships with organizations on a national level.
Would love to. Go, Allison.
Sure. So our work with the Jewish community is crucial, and our collaboration with different synagogues and Jewish agencies and institutions. But our work with the non-Jewish community is just as crucial. And I think this story of Huntsville really highlights this. If the non-Jewish community had not come out so strongly, I mean, this was a time of just incredible instability and insecurity based on the pandemic. And then your home, your place of worship, your spiritual center is vandalized. I mean, it really threw the community. But you can talk to anybody in Huntsville and they will say that they left feeling stronger and more protected than ever out of that. So we, here in Atlanta and Georgia and everywhere, we work very, very closely with all of our partners. We actually lead a coalition called Hate Free Georgia that's got 35 different organizations representing both sides of the aisle and all major affinity groups working to pass a hate crimes law in Georgia. And these relationships are really focused on this hate crimes bill in Georgia, which has some great momentum right now. But it's so much more than that. So when the horrific murder of Ahmaud Arbery surfaced, you know, we are on the phone with our friends in the Urban League and the NAACP and the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus, you know, asking what we can do and what they need. And I think these moments come full circle for the Tree of Life synagogue shooting anniversary last year. We had the leaders of the Urban League, the Islamic Speakers Bureau, the Georgia Latino elected officials, and Georgia Equality. So 4 agencies that are not Jewish and don't really have any sort of Jewish role, sitting on the stage of Abima talking about how important their role with the Jewish community is. And it's just these moments of us coming together that really, I think, define who we want to be and why we do this work in the first place.
So a couple thoughts here. So number one, I do think, to build on Allison's, very helpful comments, we indeed do work with lots of other communities at the national level and seek to create an environment which facilitates the work that happens on the ground in the regions. You know, we've been speaking out a great deal lately about the racism facing Asian Americans around COVID-19. You may have seen I wrote an op-ed with former presidential candidate Andrew Yang in USA Today back in March on this topic. We've been in consultation with a number of Asian American advocacy organizations in recent months to share with them insights, learnings, to help them deal with this issue targeting their communities, and say, you know, I'm certainly no fan of the government in Beijing, and I'm not going to defend its policies or the way it's dealt with this disease. But the idea that somehow Asian American or Chinese American people in the United States are responsible for that is disgusting, and it's racist, and it's wrong. So we're doing what we can to help advocates for them, as well as speaking out ourselves. I was proud last week to do one of these webinars with my friend Mark Morial, who heads up the National Urban League, and we have a partnership in the works with them to focus on the issues facing communities of color who indeed are being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 for lots of reasons and in lots of different ways, both on the health side and the economic side. And then finally, I'm very proud of the work that we've done to help the Latino community deal with the racism and xenophobia directed at them. We've been doing trainings with different Hispanic advocacy organizations like Unidos US and LULAC to share what we know about dealing with hate crimes, to share what we know about dealing with the victims of these bias incidents, so that their staff all across the United States is trained up to deal with the hate coming at them around immigration. Can I just say one other thing? I'm just paying attention to the chat as well. I see there's some questions about what's happening on college campuses. So our data does include anti-Semitic activity on college campuses. Our teams, our regional teams like Allison in Atlanta or in the South, are in regular touch with Hillels on college campuses, in regular touch with the administrators at universities, in regular touch with students and parents directly. So when there is an anti-Israel activity on a campus, that doesn't always mean it's anti-Semitic. But when we see the use of Nazi language to portray the Jewish state, you know, drawing these false comparisons, when we see charges of conspiracy theories leveled against Jews, somehow manipulating events, when there are speakers who are brought who espouse anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic vitriol, we absolutely, positively count it. And look, sometimes that may have, a Jewish group may bring that kind of person. We Jews are not exempt from, by intention or even inadvertently, promoting anti-Semitism. It happens. And there's nothing wrong with criticizing policies of the Jewish state, but there's something profoundly vulgar and wrong about delegitimizing the only Jewish state in the world. And that is anti-Semitism, and that we call out, period.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. That was an important addendum, and you're right, there have been a variety of questions about that. So the next question is something that I think all three of you are going to have an interesting perspective on, so I'd like all three of you to answer it. So what do you think are the factors that have contributed to the rise in anti-Semitism that we've seen this year? We know that it's been rising. Jonathan, you spoke beautifully earlier about all of these trends. What do we think are the contributing factors? Oren, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm going to take a little bit of an optimistic mode to this, but sort of recognizing that there are multiple reasons why it's maybe rising. My one point I'd like to make is sometimes reporting begets more reporting. And, in ADL, we've been advocating for people to report because data drives policy. And we are constantly asking people to do that because we know the value of it. Frankly, somebody who reports something in San Diego, that tip, that information, we may be able to connect that to something that's going on in Massachusetts. So reporting is valuable not only for the data, but to actually get a real handle. So I believe maybe part of it, it doesn't answer the question of why it's the highest ever, but maybe a small portion is because people believe the one thing they can do during these very trying times to push back on hate is to report. So I'd like to believe that to some degree.
I think Oren's right. I mean, I think increased reporting is important. We already talked about how we think it's chronically undercounted. That has something to do with it. I don't think that explains the huge spike, but it's definitely part of it. I think that's number one. Number two, we're in a charged political environment. And I think, I don't really care how you vote, but the vulgarity at the top has created an environment in which all things are okay, and in an environment where name calling has become normalized, and that has spawned anti-Semitism on both sides of the aisle, where the issue's almost not just been politicized, but weaponized for partisan gain. So I think this charged political environment has something to do with it. I think number three, there is, even before COVID-19, pervasive, if you talk to anybody like off the coast, there's pervasive economic anxiety out there. People are nervous. Again, despite the booming stock markets in recent years, the fact of the matter is that there have been issues with, with flat and lower wages, issues with increasing debt, issues with the growing divide between the haves and the have-nots. And government doesn't seem to have answers, and the markets don't seem to have answers. That creates an environment where scapegoating flourishes and thrives. We've seen this throughout history. It's happening here. So number one, charged political environment. Number two, pervasive economic anxiety. Number three, social media. The fact of the matter is social media amplifies and exacerbates all of these trends. Someone hits someone on the street in Brooklyn, and then someone videos it with their phone and turns it into a meme and sends it out on TikTok or on YouTube or on WhatsApp, and it travels. Facebook is the front line in fighting hate today because so much anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice has been pushed up and gets the kind of attention it never could in mainstream media. So again, I think charged political environment, pervasive economic anxiety, the ubiquity of social media, and then lastly, let's be honest, extremists have exploited all of these trends to insert themselves and move from the margins to the mainstream. Right-wing extremists have capitalized on this, and literally, in 2018, we tracked 12 known white supremacists who ran for public office at the local, state, and federal level. In the city of Chicago, a known neo-Nazi ran on the GOP side for Congress in Illinois' 4th congressional district, and he lost, but he got 56,000 votes. And again, we saw this all over the country. And then from the other side, sort of anti-Zionists and people espousing these ideas somehow moved into the left and running for office as well. So I don't think either side is exempt. No political party has a monopoly on morality, but extremists really, and not only do they exploit the moment then, we need to be mindful of what's happening right now. Coronavirus, you see these anti-lockdown demonstrations. Just last week, Oren's team at the Center on Extremism spotted a known neo-Nazi who had an open arrest warrant at an anti-lockdown protest in Ohio. We shared information with law enforcement. He was subsequently arrested. And we do that because this is the close collaboration that we have with those people who work so hard every day to protect us. But it's important to note that COVID-19 and the calamity it has created, don't be surprised when conspiracy theorists, when violent extremists try to further their accelerationist and outrageous ideas, and like a second virus ride on COVID-19 and bring their hate into our communities. It's quite ugly.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. Allison, do you have something to add? They were very complete in their answers.
Sure. So, yeah, I would, I mean, I completely agree with Oren and Jonathan. And just to kind of take what Jonathan said to the ground level, you know, we're seeing the impact of the political and economic instability and extremists kind of moving into the sunlight and out of the shadows, impacting people on the ground in very real ways. So we are seeing anti-Semitic content creep out into, you know, places that people would never imagine anti-Semitism to be. And sometimes it's very intentional, and sometimes we're seeing people using anti-Semitic memes or phrases and not really even understanding what they're doing. We're seeing students throwing around swastikas like it's nothing. We've had 2 of these types of incidents in my region in the past 24 hours. I mean, we're just seeing a lot of, some of it is empowerment, some of it is confusion, some of it I think is just opening the floodgates to hateful language into kind of our acceptable sphere of appropriate language that is just really uncomfortable and disturbing.
Thank you for that. I want to thank all 3 of you for taking time to be with us today and to really unpack this data and to share your personal views and your experiences. And I have to tell you that not only do you obviously have these excellent insights, but I personally am just so grateful to have you as colleagues. And every day I am impressed with the work that you do and glad to be working side by side with you. So thank you for that as well. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're glad that you were able to take your time to do so. And we hope that you will join us again next week when we continue our Fighting Hate from Home webinar series, and there will be details coming soon to your inbox. Until then, stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.